time for our second guest speaker. Ralph Bunton is Executive Vice President and Associate Editor of United Israel World Union, an author and a writer. His many articles and essays have appeared in various media outlets, including the Jerusalem Post, the United Israel Bulletin, the Southern Shofar, and the Times of Israel, where he is a regular contributor. After a distinguished career in a Fortune 500 company, he retired as Senior Vice President of Marketing in 2003. As a member of the state business delegation, he was responsible for developing joint economic trade opportunities between the state of Alabama and the state of Israel. He was instrumental in efforts leading to the passage of Alabama House of Representatives Resolution HJR 36, recognizing the Embassy 3000 campaign to encourage the nations of the world to recognize United Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the state of Israel and to move their embassies in Israel to Jerusalem. And that, of course, came to fruition, well, the recognition of the capital, Jerusalem as the capital, in December, the 6th of December 2017. The embassy, at least the US embassy, was moved to Jerusalem on May 14, 2018, under President Trump. And that, of course, was on the 70th Independence Day of Israel. He is a past member of the International Council for the Jerusalem-based Root and Branch Association, where he served as International Co-Chairman on Torah Economics and Business. He is the author of the Book of David. We have some copies at the back here. The Book of David Horowitz, Dean of the United Nations Press Corps and founder, United Israel World Union, published by Chiron Publications 2018. Please welcome to the podium, Ralph Bunton.
Good morning. Thank you, Jono, for that nice introduction, and I'd like to add my welcome to the 81st annual meeting of United Israel World Union. We have a hybrid audience today. We have those in this room. We have those on Zoom. We call them Roomers and Zoomers. So welcome to everyone, both here and far. Most of you know that our founder, David Horowitz, had a very distinguished career as the Dean of the United Nations Correspondence. When David died in 2002, he left a treasure trove of materials and files. He had written over 2,500 syndicated columns alone. We found records, copies of letters, of correspondence, photos, daily press releases, easily account for probably over 50,000 documents. And among them were many photos, both personal and professional, and some of them were official United Nations photos. So today, I'd like to share a few of those rare photos from history with you and offer you a little explanation of what you see in the photo and maybe a little background story or two that you might find interesting. So they're a portal to the past, and I hope you find our moments interesting, and they're moments captured in time. A few of what you'll see today, some of you have seen, but we have new attendees, and I've included them, and we'll move through them rather quickly, but the majority have never been shown publicly at any of our sessions. And I'll share really some interesting facts for you, and I will read a brief summary of the history of some of it that I think you might really find interesting and that you may not know. So the first thing you see here, a ticket to ride. Pictured here is a photograph of the first passport issued to a young David Horowitz when he was 21 years old. he made the trip to British-held Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, in 2024. He boarded an old steamship called USS Madonna. It departed on June 10th, 1924 for Palestine. It arrived on July 30th at Joppa. There were no deep water ports in Israel, and when the steamships arrived, they anchored offshore, and passengers and luggage had to be rowed ashore by locals, local Arabs. No harbor. David became what is commonly known as a halutz. These were pioneers to the land then. He spent 3.5 years in Mikvah, Israel Agricultural Compound near Tel Aviv, and the Ramat Gan Moshav communal farming segment. These were the Halupsim. These were the early pioneers that began to come back to the land in the late 1800s. And they were early Jewish Zionist immigrants. This was after World War I. They came to work the land and create Jewish settlements. Now, these farmers and laborers plowed fields, they drained swamps, they settled the frontiers of old Palestine under that rough and harsh British Mandate period. Now, it was during those years that David traversed the country. He witnessed so many things. He witnessed the opening of Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. In 1925, he heard Lord Balfour hail the Jews' return to the land. Also present was General Edmund Allenby, you'll recall, who led the liberation of Palestine from the Turks in 1917. David moved both north and south. He went into the Negev on horseback. That was generally the mode of transportation then. There were no paved roads. There were no roads like you would see today. There were old trade routes, the spice routes that went along the border there. And he studied earnestly. He just consumed himself in Hebrew to learn the language. And what you see here captures a moment in time. You see an early photograph with a group of Halupsim, and David, if you'll notice, David is pictured dead center in that photograph, and he's holding up a trusty canine mascot. That's their little yard dog, if you will. In the mid-1940s, David embarked on another career. That was a career at the UN as a journalist and press writer for the World Union Press, which he founded. He was the first Jewish journalist to receive press credentials by the UN, and it was during that time that he founded United Israel World Union. Pictured here, what you see is David, a younger David, interviewing Ambassador Abba Eban of Israel. And we'll learn more about Abba Eban later. And in the second photo, he's interviewing France's Pierre Mendès France during the latter's visit to the UN in 1955. Abba Eban, pictured here with David, was barely 32 years old in May of 1948 when he was called to represent the new state of Israel in the debates of the United Nations. 2 years later, he became ambassador to the United States and was the youngest envoy to Washington. Pictured here, you see Eban greeting his friend in a common cause, journalist, columnist David Horowitz, after a UN session. Later in 1952, Abba Eban was elected Vice President of the United Nations General Assembly. A little history on Eban. He worked with Moshe Sharett in liaison with the UN Special Council on Palestine. This was the group that made the first recommendation for the establishment of a Jewish state. Very educated man. Educated at Cambridge University, Eben's oratorical skills, his grasp of history, and his fluency in 10 languages made him one of Israel's very greatest spokesmen, their first U.S. ambassador. He and David were quite close. Those were the two Jewish voices, the first two Jewish voices at the United Nations. The UN's unofficial man. This is an untold, it's an unknown and largely untold story. You won't find him mentioned in the place where he had his greatest achievement. You won't find him inscribed on any roll of honor, not even a plaque on the walls. Yet this lonely refugee crusader who was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, named mankind's greatest crime, he convinced the world to confront it. It was Dr. Raphael Lemkin who coined the phrase genocide. David was a close friend of Dr. Lemkin. He was an advocate when Lemkin came to the UN, and David helped him navigate the politics of the UN bureaucracy when he arrived at the UN in 1946. At the right in the picture, you see Dr. Lemkin and Horowitz together, pictured at the UN Security Council. On a personal note, he was one of the more fascinating stories I've discovered. I did an article about Dr. Lemkin, what he accomplished in his relationship with David, and I did an article in the Times of Israel, and it received feature status in one of their in that particular issue, and that was something I was quite proud of. So, if anyone wants to hear a very interesting story about an unknown man who was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, if you'll let me know, I'll send you the link to the article. Okay, pictured here is journalist David Horowitz and his wife Nan. They're seen here greeting a very young Menachem Begin during an early 1950s visit to New York for a speaking engagement. Storyline. Nan Riley, pictured here, before she and David met and married, she met Menachem Begin years before David Horowitz met him. He was an Irish immigrant and an ardent supporter of the pro-Ergon American Committee for a Free Israel when she met the young Ergon leader, Menachem Begin. Nan possessed a very fierce loyalty to the Jewish people and became an outspoken advocate of an independent state of Israel and a strong opponent of all kinds of anti-Semitism. Menachem Begin's storied career took him from commander of the Ergon underground Jewish movement to a successful political career. He became the 6th Prime Minister of Israel in 1977 and was a co-recipient of the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize. Here's an interesting photo, and one of the more historic, I think, that we have, and really a good story behind it. Nikita Khrushchev, you'll remember that name. Many of you are old enough to know who he was leader of the Soviet Union from 1955 till 1964. Serving as premier during the height of the Cold War, his leadership was marked by a series of high-profile international crises. Many of us remember those crises. There was the shooting down of an American U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union in 1960, the building of the notorious Berlin Wall in 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war. Khrushchev was notorious for his eccentric outburst. He once pulled off his right shoe and banged it on the desk at arguably one of the stormiest sessions to ever take place at the UN. Here in the picture, you see journalist David Horowitz, who had interviewed and written about countless world leaders, greeting Soviet leader Khrushchev at the UN just before he entered the General Assembly in 1960, where the infamous shoe-banging incident took place. By the way, second from the right is Andrei Gromyko. You might remember him from Russian politics. Do you recognize this lady? Anyone remember her? On March 17th, 1979, 71-year-old Golda Meir was elected the fourth Prime Minister of Israel following the untimely death of Levi Eshkol. After serving as Minister of Labor and Foreign Minister, Golda Meir became Israel's first and only woman to hold the office of Prime Minister. She was born in Kyiv, Russia. She grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and attended the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. She served as Israel's Prime Minister during a very difficult period, including the Munich massacre in 1972 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. An interesting tidbit. At one point, when she was a member of Israel's parliament, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion sent her on a secret mission, disguised as an Arab, to plead with King Abdullah I of Jordan not to enter the war with Israel. The picture you see here is Mrs. Meir, probably receiving a few words of counsel by journalist David Horowitz. The Tale of Two Swedes. David Horowitz and Dag Hammarskjöld first met in 1973 when Hammarskjöld, who was a Swedish diplomat and economist, was elected the new Secretary General of the United Nations after Trayvon Lai's resignation. Horowitz and Hammarskjöld were both Swedes. They became very good friends, and the fact that they shared the same birthplace gave them a real keen and great working chemistry between them. The friendship and respectful working relationship continued until Hammarskjöld's tragic death in 1960 while he was on his way to the Congo. The circumstances of the tragic death remain shrouded in mystery for years. Dag Hammarskjöld was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize posthumously in 1961, having been nominated before his death. In 2011, the Financial Times wrote that Hammarskjöld has remained the benchmark against which later UN Secretaries General has been judged. Historian Paul Kennedy hailed Hammarskjöld as perhaps the greatest UN secretary we've ever had. Pictured here, you see David Horowitz on the far right, along with other journalists, with Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld on the left, in the last photo ever taken of him as he left for the Congo aboard that fatal flight. This is an old newspaper clipping I came across. Here's an image of an old photo taken in 1966 at the Manhattan apartment of David Horowitz. He had just been elected president of the Foreign Press Association. If you look, seated on the right, are David and Nan Horowitz. David has his arm around Nan. Standing at the right front is Italian journalist and close Horowitz friend, John Capelli. He was secretary of the FPA at the time. John and David shared room 373 at the United Nations for over 40 years, dating from 1960. According to his journalist son, Vanny, who sent this photo to me. John Capelli kept this photo next to his computer to the end of his life. Maybe a story you don't know was that of Kurt Joseph Waldheim. I'm sure you remember the name. He served as the 4th Secretary General of the United Nations between 1972 and 1981. He was the 9th President of Austria from 1986 to 1992. In 1985, accusations emerged that Waldheim had served as an officer in the German army that had committed wartime atrocities. Declassified CIA documents later revealed that the CIA had been aware of his wartime past since 1945. In 1987, the U.S. Justice Department banned Waldheim from entering the United States. He served as a Secretary General at the UN. David Horowitz credited Israeli UN Ambassador Benjamin Netanyahu for the exposure of Waldheim from documents found in the UN War Crimes Archives located in the basement of the United Nations headquarters. In the photo here, UN Secretary Waldheim is shown here at a press briefing. He's seated behind the desk. Seated to the right of the vacant chair that you see in the center is journalist David Horowitz, reporting for the World Union Press. Meet the Boyos. It's another story I didn't know about, and another discovery I made, and it's another article I'm writing. In fact, it probably would be my next for the Times of Israel. Rudolph Bojo was president of the Silbo Steel Corporation in Denville, New Jersey. Horowitz had the rare privilege of knowing Rudolph and his wife, Rhoda, and through them came to know others in the distinguished family, including Professor Hugo and Dr. Elizabeth Bojo. Here's their story. I'll read it to you briefly. The steel executive was one of the early supporters of Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel in 1969, and along with his wife created the Boyko Institute for Saline Water Agriculture in 1980, perpetuating the research of his late brother Hugo Boyko, a scientist. In addition to endowing a chair at the Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, in honor of the work of brother Hugo and wife Elizabeth, the details also involve the construction of the building known today as the Boyko Research Center. Brother Hugo and his famous partner scientist, Dr. Elizabeth Boyko, are both renowned in Israel for their scientific accomplishments in bringing new life to the previously barren Negev Desert. For their accomplishments, the Boyko husband and wife team received the prestigious Fleming Award in 1959 for the advancement of human welfare through outstanding achievements in science. David Horowitz and his wife Nan enjoyed a very close relationship with the Boykos. Both were in attendance as guests of the Boykos at the dedication of the Boyko Research Center at BGU on September 3rd, 1981. Seen here together, the bottom photo, at a little Sukkot gathering, are left to right, David, Rudy, Rhoda, and Nan. By the way, it's the same little Sukkot location in New Jersey where James Tabor and I met with David in 1973 and agreed to carry forward the work of UIW in succeeding years. David had just turned 90 years old. Recognize this man, either of these men. Yes, it's Kirk Douglas, one of the most famous actors in Hollywood. There was Horowitz showing his Hollywood connections. It would only be one of. The centurion of the cinema was an American actor, producer, director, and author, one of the last living people of the industry's golden age. Douglas was born Ishar Danlovich in Amsterdam, New York in 1916. His parents were Jewish immigrants that had come over from Russia. It was a part of what is present-day Belarus. The family spoke Yiddish at home. Douglas appeared in more than 90 movies, spanning a 64-year acting career. Here you see Douglas being interviewed by journalist David Horowitz in 1949. It was the year Douglas starred in the movie Champion, for which he was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. During his career, David Horowitz met or interviewed many celebrities and entertainers. He formed lasting relationships with a few, including Shirley MacLaine and Sammy Davis Jr. On occasion, he would arrange celebrity visits to the UN, where an actor or an actress would visit New York. And on one such occasion, he invited Gloria Swanson to visit the UN and speak to a group of fellow journalists. That's the pictures you see here. Gloria Swanson was an American actress and producer, best known for her role as Norma Desmond, a reclusive silent film star in the critically acclaimed 1950 film Sunset Boulevard. And a little-known fact, Mrs. Swanson was honored with 2 stars on Hollywood's Walk of Fame, one for motion pictures, the other for television. You'll see several photos shown here with Mrs. Swanson. She's seen here addressing the UN journalist group while an amused David Horowitz sits to her left. In the other photos, and I'll just mention a couple of things. Here are a few other photos with Swanson during that same meeting. These photos were taken by iconic Italian-born journalist Sante Vasali, a good friend of John Capelli, who shared room 373 with David Horowitz that I mentioned earlier. These are Getty images sent to me courtesy of Vanni Capelli, the journalist son of John, which I mentioned earlier. They're self-explanatory. You see the photos here. Both David and Gloria Swanson are in the photos. You'll see some with her standing, speaking to the audience, or speaking to the gathering, and seated. It was John Capelli that asked Sante to come and shoot the FPA event. And both David and John were there when Dr. Martin Luther King spoke at the UN the next year. Other friends and acquaintances of David included Wolf Pasmanik. He was a well-known reporter and poet who, during the Hitler period, had managed to escape Poland to the Soviet Union, then made his way on to the United States. He was a descendant of a famous family of scholars and rabbis. His mystical poetry reflected the tragedy of the Nazi period and the Holocaust, and provokes a soul-searching criticism of the inhumanity and lack of justice among nations. Seen here with Horowitz in David's office at the UN, David and Wolf were both close friends with the famous author Elie Wiesel. James and I remember Wolf very well from those early years of meetings in New York. Here you see President of the 35th session of the General Assembly, Baron von Wijkmar, congratulating David Horowitz on his election as president of the UN Correspondents Association. You'll see Secretary General Kurt Waldheim in the center of the photo. He, you will remember, is the ex-Secretary General later banned from entering the United States. I love this photo. I'd like to read you a summary of the background. As 1980 ended, David Horowitz received a telegram from Eric Spector. He was the general chairman of the Jabotinsky Centennial Dinner, scheduled for November 11th at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. The affair was held to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the birth of Zeev Jabotinsky. It was then that Horowitz learned that he was to be the recipient of the prestigious Jabotinsky Centennial Award medal and citation. Jabotinsky is a towering figure in the history of Zionism. He was a Zionist activist, orator, and writer who founded both the Betar movement, that was a Zionist youth movement, and later the Jewish Legion of the British Army during World War I. He was fascinated by Theodore Herzl. He was later elected as a delegate to the 6th Zionist Conference. Now the photo. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin is shown here presenting the coveted award to journalist David Horowitz in recognition of his distinguished service to the State of Israel and to the Jewish people. Now, we're going to pause and play you a clip from an old newsreel. That, again, I have to credit Vanny Capelli for doing a lot of sleuth work for me and sending these things to me to prepare for the meeting. This is a clip of another famous UN correspondent that David Horowitz was close to. Give us just a moment to cue it up.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Johnny Jones of the Globe Syndicate speaking to you from Amsterdam, Holland, where I've been an eyewitness to the assassination of the Dutch cabinet minister Van Meer, the key figure of European politics. He alighted from his car and made his way toward me. Halfway, he was stopped by a news photographer who asked for a picture. Van Meer consented and was shot dead by a revolver held close to the photographer's camera. I pursued the assassin through the crowd only to lose him in traffic.
Follow that car! Quick! Say, you better get out of here. This might be dangerous.
You're Basilic, right on.
Trouble, who's he shot?
Van Meer assassinated.
No, Jeffrey Blyth didn't cover that assassination, but he did have a trench coat, and he did cover many very big stories, like the wedding of the year, and revolutions, pop sensations, and dictators, and of course the assassination we will never forget. But let's go back to the beginning, way back when Jeffrey was just 16, working in South Shields at the Shields Gazette as a cub reporter for 7 shillings a week. Then it was off to war, or at least off to being a 20-year-old reporter on Union Jack, the British Army newspaper which was published at the end of the war out of Venice. Jeffrey lived in a room right by the Rialto. On his 21st birthday, he got very drunk on grappa and never drank grappa again. But Venice, beautiful Venice, was the city he always loved. Then back to Britain, first to Manchester and then to Southampton as a shipping correspondent for the London Daily Mail. When sailing on the liners, the United States or the Queen Elizabeth was the most glamorous way to travel to America. And it was also where Jeffrey got his first big scoop. He discovered the car the Soviet spies Burgess and McLean used when they boarded a boat in Southampton to flee England. Later in Moscow, Jeffrey learned from Guy Burgess that on that fateful night they were together in the bar of the San Malo boat. Of course, Jeffrey didn't know who Burgess was at the time. He said he once told the story about the odd coincidence to a colleague in Cairo, the Daily Telegraph reporter named Kim Philby. Philby, who became known as the Third Man, was also a Soviet spy, and needless to say, was amused. Next, there was Jeffrey's visit to Moscow with the first party of British tourists to enter the Soviet Union after the war. Note, Jeffrey was the only one in a blazer. All the others were communists. And at the time, there was also a plane crash or two, but that couldn't faze him, because he was promoted to chief European correspondent, just in time to cover the wedding of the year between actress Grace Kelly and Monte Carlo's Prince Rainier. At the wedding, he got his great world scoop that beat the 1,300 other reporters who were assembled for the event. Jeffrey got an exclusive interview the night before the wedding with Prince Rainier. How did he do it? He asked for it. And with Olivetti in hand, he flew across Europe and the Middle East from crisis to crisis, from the conflict in Suez to the bloody streets of Hungary. He got his news copy out of Budapest and into Vienna and onto the front pages of the Mail by driving across a minefield. Watching the murder of Hungary was the story he said he never forgot. There were a couple of years when Jeffrey was practically everywhere, in Europe, Asia, and the Mideast. From interviewing Ingrid Bergman in Rome, to flying to India and Afghanistan with Ike, to spending weeks banqueting with Onassis and the King of Saudi Arabia, somewhere in the Arabian Sea. Yes, the king gave him that robe. Jeffrey was the Daily Mail's chief American correspondent for more than 15 years. During the time, he ran a London to New York air race that celebrated the anniversary of Alcock and Brown, the British pilots that first flew across the Atlantic. He was a founding member of the Overseas Press Club.
Had you heard of Jeffrey Blyth? He was pretty famous. He and David were close. They were both journalists. I'm about to share something they held in common. These were those glory years of press and of news. These were the years of Walter Cronkite, Walter Winchell, Lowell Thomas. Some of us are old enough to remember. These are the people who David knew. These are the people who was David's world in the world that he operated. And for a half a century, he sat at the UN, this parliament of nation, this parliament of man, David would call them, and watched all these events unfold. The photo that you see here, Jeffrey Blyth is the tall fellow, third from left in the back row, between John Capelli and David Horowitz. On the extreme left in the front row is Paul Uper, a Hungarian correspondent with whom Capelli was very close. Note the list of names on the board in the next shot. We can move to the next shot. Yeah. Okay. Who was serving on the board at the time. Both Jeffrey Blyth and David Horowitz both served as president of the Foreign Press Association at the United Nations. Do you remember Henry Kissinger? Henry Kissinger was an American diplomat, political scientist, geopolitical consultant, and politician who served as the United States Secretary of State and National Security Advisor in the presidential administration of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford between 1969 and 1977. Here's Henry Kissinger addressing the UN General Assembly. And what I'll be showing you now is just simply some of those old official UN photos that you may or may not have seen, but photos we uncovered in all those archives of David Horowitz when packed box after box after box. We go through those things, and as James would say, you know, we couldn't afford to throw anything away because under receipts from the dry cleaning or cancel checks or something, there would be a letter. Oh, it's a letter from Menachem Begin, you know, or Eleanor Roosevelt or something. So we had to sift through those, you know, many, many documents. Surely you'll recognize this gentleman. From 1984 to 1988, Benjamin Netanyahu was permanent representative of Israel to the UN. Of course, he later became one of the first native sons, one of the first Sabras, to become Prime Minister of Israel, and is now Israel's longest serving Prime Minister. Bibi and David were very good friends. Again, they were the Jewish voices at that time at this Parliament of Man. Often, Bibi would drop by on Hanukkah or something, and he and David would light candles together in David's little office at the UN. In 1997, I was in New York and was meeting with David, and I was there on business, but I always made time to spend time with David. In 1997, I mentioned to him that I was selected as one of Alabama's representatives to go to Israel and to meet with Israeli counterparts on the issue of fostering business between the two states. And I mentioned to David, I said, I'm going to be in Israel, and I'm going over with the business delegation with the governor. And he says, "You're going to be meeting with Bibi?" And I said, "Yes, David, we're going to be meeting with the Prime Minister." He says, "You must take him a letter from me. I have something to say to Bibi." So he did that. He emailed it to me. And over the course of our meetings on that mission, we did indeed meet with Benjamin Netanyahu and handed him the personal letter from David. And it kind of took him aback. We were in a room, the press was there, and people were seated around the table. And so he carefully unfolded it. He just paused for a minute while everybody waited. Then this big smile broke forth. And he says, "You tell David I'll answer him personally." Then we got back to business. So they were close. Next photo, no comment. I just wanted you to see an angry Bibi at one of the sessions. You can see how youthful he looked at that time. A gift to Bibi. This is a photo of a gift of a book written by Zeev Jabotinsky, which we talked about early, which David won the Jabotinsky Award. I mentioned him early. A gift of his book being presented to Bibi. The photo's from 1986. I've yet been unable to identify the other person that's presenting the book to Netanyahu in the photo. Okay? I had to include this. It was a note, personal note from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or I say a personal note, but it offered a Mazel Tov greeting to David Horowitz on the occasion of David's 95th birthday. We all celebrated that together with David, James and I and others in New York. And David, he just beamed about it. He said, I got a note from Bibi. You see the little note he scribbled across at the top? That's where he had to send a copy. He sent a copy to Rebecca and me. I mean, Rebecca is my wife, and he just had to send it and say, "Got this from Bibi," and share it. So I have that today in my files. Okay, Menachem Begin we mentioned earlier in the slides, was the 6th Prime Minister of Israel. But before the creation of the State of Israel, he was the leader of that Zionist underground movement that I mentioned earlier, Ergon. It was a revisionist breakaway from the larger Jewish parliamentary organization, the Haganah, which you may have heard of. David is shown here standing in front of the very room that Begin occupied during the early period of the resistance. And a few photos I'd like to close with that you may enjoy. Here's an old photo that we've not shown before that I uncovered. It's a picture of David at the wall. David at the wall at the city of David. I don't know the date, it's unknown. And then a couple of, I guess, rare or unknown official UN photos that David had in a bottom desk drawer that we uncovered. I did a little research. I wanted to find out what was going on here. These are official historic UN photos from David Horowitz's file. It has to do with the Egypt and Israel historic connection. In 1973, when Israel and Egypt signed the historic peace agreement, this is a desert meeting of Israeli and Egyptian military representatives. I was able to track down who was in these photos, and you'll see Major General Mohammed El-Gamsi, he's head of the Egyptian delegation, and Major General Aaron Yarhov, head of the Israeli delegation. This was a meeting on November 24th, 1973, at kilometer 101 on the Cairo-Suez Road. General Yarov is shown at the right, bottom right front, wearing glasses. General El-Gamsi is at the left. He's wearing a dark tie, and I think he's probably the one seated where you see the top of his head. Here's another taken on November 14th, 1973, that you'll see General Yarov shaking hands with General El-Gamsi. At this meeting, the Egyptian side handed the Israelis a complete list of Israeli prisoners of war. That peace agreement of 1973 is still in place today, over a half century later. Okay, final snapshots. Found this one, David the Younger. I'd like to close with these. These were the early years, probably around the time or just before the beginning of David's UN career in the founding of United Nations, or United Israel World Union. One I call David the Younger. Here's David the Elder. This was taken at the UN Garden on December 1976. That famous picture of David at his desk at the UN. It seems an entire history of the UN could be found in David Horowitz's little office. His desk and walls were a virtual collage, crammed with photos and papers. Here's what he had on the shelves of what I can identify. He had a Jewish menorah. He had all Jewish memorabilia. He had a mezuzah, an Israeli flag, Kiddush cups, an embroidered kippah, a Hanukkah menorah, and a photo of Jerusalem. Many of the items you see here were gifts from visiting delegates and dignitaries. Covering the walls were many photos of David with dignitaries from all over the world depicting his long participation in the history of the UN. He's shown here in his little office compiling another syndicated column before a press deadline. The photograph is around 1970. By the way, the old Underwood typewriter you see in the picture that David used all those many years, we retained, and it's in our David Horowitz Memorial Library in Charlotte today. So when you go there, we'll be able to show you. I love this picture. Here's David at a Hanukkah candle lighting at the UN in 1973. I think it shows a more contemplating and mystical side of David Horowitz. The words of the prophets aren't just written on the subway walls. They also appear on a wall at the United Nations compound. The inscription is known as the Isaiah Wall. It's located on the west side of First Avenue at 43rd Street, and it's a popular gathering spot for demonstrators. It's across the street from the General UN Assembly building. These words were chiseled into the granite, and it's a best-known quotation from the book of Isaiah. The inscription you see here in letters 8 inches high was etched into the granite around 1950. At about the same time, the United Nations complex was built. Colonel David Horowitz, who witnessed the construction of both, is seen here posing in front of the Isaiah Wall. Lastly, this was one of David's official UN photos. And I'll close by saying this. As the Dean of the UN Press Corps, David Horowitz left an indelible legacy, and he's well deserving of his place among the heroes of his people and that of his journalistic profession. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed our trip down memory lane.